has heard of safety clutter or the concept of decluttering at some point in time? Can I just get a show of hands? Okay, cool. So at least we're talking to the right people in the right room. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a fantastic group of people, and I live in South Australia, having grown up in New South Wales, and one of the things that I appreciate about being here and with groups of people like you is that this is a much more intimate, much more connected community of health and safety professionals. So it really is quite an honour to be here in service of you, if decluttering or the concept of safety clutter is something that's interesting to you. Now, Kim said that this is going to be a little bit different. In that sense, I'm not a big fan of talking heads, so I'm actually far more comfortable, and I think you'll get far more value out of something like the panel, which we're going to have following this, because dialogue is a better way to learn than just hearing one point of view. But the concept of safety clutter and decluttering is relatively new. So I am going to go through relatively quickly what I'll call a sprinkling of concepts, and then we'll have the back half of the presentation for some dialogue and discussions and questions. And even if you don't have a question, I'm not going to shut you down. I'd like you to share your thoughts or challenges or things like that. Is that comfortable? Are we okay with that as an agreement? Okay. Did anyone here get the email and do the Safety Clutter Scorecard in the last week or so? Can I get a high show of hands? Okay, so there's a sprinkling of people here who know what that's about. When we talk about safety clutter, I think it's important as a new concept for us to understand what are we actually talking about before we get too excited about taking action. That's what we'll do in the first couple of minutes here. So Safetycluttercom is a free resource that's available in the service of health and safety professionals and businesses in Australia to deal with this problem of safety clutter. The collaboration is between myself and the Safety on Tap team, and you heard about me from Kim in the introduction. The other half of the collaboration in Safetycluttercom is a guy called Dr. Dave Provan. So he's one of the academics from Griffith University who's the author of the original academic research that describes the phenomenon of safety clutter, along with his colleagues Dr. Drew Ray and Sydney Decker was also mentioned by Martin. So that's what Safetyclutter.com is all about. So when we're talking about something, I think it's really important we don't spend enough time on understanding what our words actually mean. So safety clutter, the definition of safety clutter is the accumulation and persistence of things of safety work that do not contribute to operational safety. So that is the theoretical construct, if you like, for what safety clutter actually is. And it's important that we talk about it because it's really easy to misunderstand what we're actually talking about. There's a lot of misnomers, and I want to make sure that we spend time talking about that today. And that comes from the research. You can see the paper reference there. This concept of safety work, which was the one in the air quotes, comes from this model of institutional work called safety work or the safety of work. The important parts that you need to know is that we do a number of things in the name of safety. And we often don't have enough of a conversation about why are we doing them, to what end are we doing these things. And so there's some interesting insights that'll come out of this later. But in short, the model describes a couple of different motivations. Social safety is making sure that we feel like safety is important, that it's part of our agenda, that it is one of our top priorities, if not the top priority. Demonstrated safety is making sure that we show that to other people, so that me as the leader, me as the safety professional, me as the frontline person, that I show other people that safety is important. That showing also extends to our supply chain, so to our principal contractors, the other people that we deal with, our suppliers and things like that. That's demonstrated safety. Administrative safety is the stuff where safety professionals spend most of their time, and that ties in sometimes with demonstrated safety. That's creating policies and procedures, audits and checks, inspections and things like that. This is the idea of a bureaucracy, which is a way to manage a process in business, and that's been around since Taylorism and Ford, and it's not necessarily the only way to do it. And indeed, it's also not the only way to demonstrate compliance, as you've heard from Martin. Physical safety are the things that specifically go towards safety. So that's new equipment, changes to designs, that sort of stuff. And sometimes safety professionals spend some time in this space. You would describe this as the area of controls, if you like. So controls that come out of our processes, that's physical safety. But it's not the same thing as operational safety, which is actually the work that gets done every day. And that's ordinarily a space where, as safety professionals, we spend almost no time influencing and understanding. So this is the model that helps us understand and ask that question, is this safety work or is this the safety of work? A little bit of history, so past, present and future. As I said, this is academic evidence-based work. So the first paper, which that diagram comes from, is Safety Work versus the Safety of Work. And this is very reputable journals that this has been published in. The next one is about safety clutter, defining the phenomenon that flows on from this idea of safety work, which is where safety clutter comes from. The next one that I want to talk about is the body of knowledge, and I'm glad that David mentioned it because I think we spend enough time as non-students understanding what professional practice looks like in the context of our body of knowledge. This chapter, if you haven't seen it, is about the OHS professional as a critical consumer of research. So it's really important that we recognise that the vast majority of safety practice doesn't actually have an evidence base. There is no research or evidence to support what we do and how it relates to safety. That is true and uncomfortable. That is one of the reasons why in this piece of work it's really important that we take an evidence-based approach to dealing with safety clutter or decluttering. And that led us to the creation of this free Safety Clutter Scorecard, which some of you have done. So that's available at safetyontap.com. The idea behind this is that we are trying to socialise the idea of safety clutter and decluttering in a way that is anchored in the evidence so that we can all improve our practice. And that's what brings us here today. So there's some fears and barriers and objections which we explored in a conference like this not that long ago, and I thought it might be some useful data to talk to you about. This is really insightful. So in a room like this, I asked the room, if you get this concept of safety clutter, if you think that there are things that don't contribute to operational safety that we do, then what are your biggest concerns, fears or barriers? Now this is a question that is really critical to the process of change. This is how coaches work. It's actually, the new bit is not the hard bit. It's actually moving away from where we are right now. So these are the top 3 barriers. Demonstrating compliance to some other party. So this is the fears, concerns or objections associated with decluttering. There was also causing harm by removing something important. That's reasonable, you would think. And then there's also losing data, information or knowledge. Now, here's the insightful bit. 41% of the respondents listed that as the top concern, demonstrating compliance. 29% on losing data and 19% on causing harm. What that means is, as safety professionals, which is the vast majority of people who've completed this scorecard, we are more than twice concerned associated with proving something to someone else than we are about potential harm associated with our actions. I think that's a really worrying indictment on the work that we do. And so this goes to Martin's point and to David's point about the need for us to question and challenge the way that we operate. So the other insight out of this recent research that we've done is also that we are emotional. So we primed people when we asked the question, do you have fears? Fears was one of the words we asked about. So it's biased in that way, but it's interesting to see what fears come up. So words like loss and scary and uncomfortable and protective are the sorts of things that we feel when we start talking about decluttering. We have to have a conversation with ourselves about how we're feeling about this, because I think we've got to get over some of this stuff. But whilst we are emotional about this idea of safety clutter and decluttering, it's also important to recognise that safety clutter isn't just a benign thing, it is actually dangerous. So the research proves that the presence of safety clutter, things in businesses in the name of safety that don't contribute to operational safety, actually steal ownership from line managers, competes with production, it's distracting, it erodes trust and more. So it's actually damaging, it's actually dangerous. And so you could argue that safety clutter is actually a hazard. Now this is a really interesting one. So if you go on and do the scorecard, you'll answer some of these questions. For those of you who do have the scorecard, you will have answered this question. Now I want you to just get a piece of paper down. The question is, or the statement is, I believe that in my organisation a lot of time is spent doing things in the name of safety without actually improving safety. Can I just get you to write, everyone write down on your piece of paper now, one of these 5 options. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. So just write that down. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up or anything like that. I just want you to write it down so that you know where you sit when I reveal the data. Has everyone written something down? Try and go quickly so we get to your dialogue. So this is the result. More than 180 people, the vast majority of which are safety professionals, strongly agree or agree that we spend a lot of time doing things that have nothing to do with safety. So you could have a hypothesis here which suggests that 70% of safety professionals have no idea what they're doing and 13% are the good ones. Is that a reasonable hypothesis? It could be, but I think we're full of ourselves if that's the case. I think it's actually more reasonable to entertain that we know that this problem exists and that we are honest with ourselves and our potential role in it and our acts or omissions that contribute to it, and that we just don't know what to do about it. Because the thing is that there are more triggers to add stuff to safety than there are to take it away. Is that true? So this is an interesting insight. So a little bit more about the effects of safety clutter. So safety clutter damages employee ownership in safety. So this is based on the research. I'm not giving you an opinion here. It creates problems of indifferentiation. So people don't actually know what's actually important and what's not important. It is bad for adaptability, and this goes to Martin's point about new and emerging safety philosophies, which actually recognise that in complex work and complex situations, we can't actually control or predict what's going to happen. And so what we need to do is we need to build flexibility and adaptability into a resilient system. So if you like, instead of saying there's one way to do it, we say don't go beyond this one and don't go beyond that one, and you have freedom within the middle. And so safety clutter is actually bad for adaptability. It erodes trust. So this has a very serious cultural impact. Who here has ever heard someone say, you're just asking me to do this, or this only exists to cover someone's Has anyone ever heard a comment like that? This is exactly what we're talking about, and it happens all the time. And creating additional trade-offs between safety and productivity. And so this is very relevant. So if you've got a supervisor who needs to spend 15 minutes at the beginning of a job, or half an hour, or whatever it is, doing paperwork, then you're actually taking that supervisor away from doing supervisory work, which is actually operational safety. And so that is the trade-off that we create when we have fingerprints on safety clutter. So the Safety Clutter Scorecard goes through a number of things. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's what we're trying to do with the Safety Clutter Scorecard is to help you start a conversation about the potential extent of safety clutter in your organisations. So it asks you questions about these sorts of things. I'm sure you would recognise most of them. Would you like to know a few insights from the data? Would that be helpful? And then we'll get to your questions, I promise. The number one concern, again, so the vast majority of this sample is health and safety professionals. The number one candidate for safety clutter is safety performance reporting and injury rate reporting. Would anyone agree with that? Stick your hand up really high because we need to be serious about this. Okay, so that's interesting because if we ask the question to our frontline people, I guarantee you that that's not going to come up. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. So as mostly safety professionals, that is our number one concern. 75% of respondents, more than 180 people, believe that this is potential safety clutter. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's where we kind of get stuck. And that's where I hope to help you get unstuck today. The second one is safety committee meetings. So 69% of respondents agree that safety committee meetings are potentially safety clutter. Would anyone agree with that? So none of this is new, right? So this piece about the 70% on the left-hand side saying the vast majority of what we do potentially doesn't contribute to the safety work, this is not news to you, right? So the front end of the problem, knowing that there's a problem, is not the focus, it's actually what we do. Now there's a few more insights. Personal risk assessments, take 5 start cards, and site hazard logs were the next 2 down. So these are the top 4 that you've just seen from our sample. Now, I haven't given you the data on this because it gets a little bit skewed between the extent to what people think it could be safety clutter and the proportion of people. But in any case, this is insightful about what this sample of mostly safety professionals think are the primary targets for safety clutter and decluttering. But don't declutter on this because this data set that I'm talking to you about is a disaggregated group of professionals from all over the world. Mostly safety people. It's a hugely biased sample. It's interesting, but it's hugely biased. And so the more important sample that you need to focus on is what sample? Your organisation, within your organisation, your context, that's where you actually need to be deriving your own insights and getting your own data about potential safety clutter. So there's 3 questions that we need to ask about safety clutter in order for us to satisfy ourselves that it meets the definition, and it's called the 3 Cs. So the first one is, to what extent did this actually contribute to safety? The second one is, how confident are we that we know that? And that's by evidence, and there's 2 types of evidence. There's evidence that exists in literature somewhere else, or that someone else has done, and that's relevant to our context, or there's evidence we create ourselves. And this is a new thing which goes back to the body of knowledge and not only being critical consumers of evidence, of research, but actually creating our own. And the third is consensus. So to what extent do stakeholders involved agree with those first 2 things? The third one is the most important one. So a sample of one safety person doing a safety clutter scorecard is not sufficient for you to know whether something is safety clutter. And in the report on the second last page, where we talk about the data insights that you get out of your scorecard, it says this will tell you 0 about the potential for safety clutter in your organisation, because you have to go and do this yourself. So this is the 3 Cs. Now, the other interesting thing which I touched on before is this idea of what we call the ratchet. And it's this, if you sit down and you think about what potentially causes safety clutter, you know how a ratchet works? One click at a time and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, or if you're using a jack, it's higher and higher and higher. It only goes in one direction until you actually release the ratchet. And so the thing is that we operate in a system, in a safety system, which is informed by laws and standards and professional practice and things that we make up, because we make up a lot of stuff. And it just continues to ratchet in the direction of adding. And we don't ever take stuff away. And to be honest, many of us are quite fearful of taking things away. And why are we fearful? What's our number one concern? Not being able to demonstrate compliance. So we're actually not that concerned about whether we take something away and it affects safety. We're more concerned about showing someone else. So we need to introduce triggers for us to take stuff away, but we have to do it in a way that is evidence-based. Because if something goes wrong, we need to explain ourselves, right? Is that reasonable? Okay. Which is interesting because when things go wrong and they ask, well, why was all these processes here? The regulator never asks, well, did this actually work? They just say you didn't comply with your process. Yeah? So it's not the regulator's job to prove that, it's our job. So, tackling safety clutter. So, it requires an evidence-based approach. As a critical consumer or creator of evidence, we need to do this properly. So, there's a couple of things that we need to do. The first thing, like I said, don't go out and declutter straight away. This is not a Marie Kondo job. This is actually starting to have a conversation in our organisation about safety clutter. So if this is a new concept for you, you need to get familiar with it. Go and do the Safety Clutter Scorecard. I'm recording this presentation right now and you can listen to my podcast in a couple of weeks and you can share that with people. The conversation is important. So we need to do a bit of thinking before acting. We can't just act our way into a new way of thinking. The second thing is finding the low-hanging fruit based on the 3 C's. And that is the start of our evidence generation process. That is the start of our logical, experimental approach. And the third one is conducting a controlled safety clutter removal trial. Now this again is scary to some people, but it's not that complicated for you to have a hypothesis about safety clutter and to test that hypothesis. And lastly, I think we need to go to this big challenge of redefining the role of safety professionals. My collaborator, Dr. David Proven, his PhD was focused entirely, in fact he's the world's #1 expert on the role of the safety professional. And so safety clutter, you can join the dots here, that the safety clutter work that has flowed out of that work quite clearly says that safety clutter is an important problem, if you like, that safety professionals need to tackle. A couple of resources for you before we get to your questions and discussion. So safetycluttercom is where you can go and do the free scorecard. SafetyOnTap.com, episode 92, you'll hear a little bit about the safety of work and safety work. Episode 120, I interviewed a lady called Michelle Oberg, who's a safety innovation lead. How's that for a new job title? And so what her job is to actually explore in her organisation opportunities for them to innovate. Safety clutter is one of the things that she does. She tells a story about an experiment that they've run on pre-starts. And then finally, episode 41, which is my first interview with Dave Proven, talks about how we need to rethink our role. Because if we continue to try and stick with our existing way of thinking, and try and tackle safety clutter, then we're only going to get so far. If we rethink who we are and what we do, then I think we've got a better chance of dealing with safety clutter. I want to hear your questions, I want to hear your objections, I want to hear your challenges, because the dialogue is the important part of us moving forward with this. So hopefully that's been a helpful sprinkling for you. I'm looking forward to the chat next. So thank you.